not to be photographed, it's okay. No, it's okay. I'm just weird about it. I can't focus on writing. Well, it was really bad as a viewer. Anyway, I'll let she or her or gender neutral pronouns, and I'll let my wings introduce themselves.
Okay, Tashfia, prefer pronoun she.
I am Hana and prefer pronoun she.
Great. And then if I could get for each team who is speaking first, and please feel free to introduce yourself and what pronouns you would prefer if you so choose. So if I could get opening government.
Hi, Sam speaking first, UADS.
And Duncan speaking second, UADS.
Opening opposition.
Dena speaking first, she, her.
And Caroline speaking second, she, her.
Closing government.
Jackie speaking first, she, her.
And Elle, she, her.
And closing opposition.
Alan first, Ian. Charles, no preference.
Fantastic. All right. Does one of you mind timing? Okay. Thank you very much. All right. Then, assuming there are no further questions or concerns, I call upon the Prime Minister to defend the motion that shall stand in the next period.
Sorry, can I just move that a little bit? Inside government, what we tell you today is that having an entire organisation where workers get no representation, where the norms of labour representation are completely disregarded, is illegitimate in the modern world. Specifically, we think in Western liberal democracies, it's particularly illegitimate given the strong level of workers' rights that other workers have. What we're going to do in government is chat firstly about sort of why we think that the armed forces in particular are actually one of the industries that most need trade unions because of the unique characteristics that are attached to it. Then talk specifically about why we think the characteristics of hierarchy make people very vulnerable. Then talk about why we think that it's particularly important in terms of the long-term effects of soldiers and so on. That it's very important actually that they have trade unions because being in the army is one of the things that stays with you for your whole life. For example, through things like post-traumatic stress disorder, we think trade unions are a very good means of dealing with that. We'll go through all of that in a minute. Firstly, just a wee bit of a mech. Basically, what we think is that soldiers will be able to join trade unions. Obviously, it's not going to be a closed shop. You don't have to join it if you don't want to. It's very much a voluntary association. You have your union deductions deducted out your pay packet, whatever. Specifically, one condition that we would attach is that we wouldn't allow the trade unions to go on strike. We have similar measures, for example, in the UK, where police officers and the police federation can't go on strike, but they can do all kinds of other labour actions just short of withdrawing their labour. We think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, given the function of the armed forces as the defender of last resort of the country. So we think that would be the only particular restriction we put on them. So it's very similar to UK police forces. I'm sure it's probably similar elsewhere. Anyone got any questions on that before I go on? No? Cool. Okay. Right. So how do we think the army, moving on to sort of the first point, a bit of framing, what do we think the characteristics of the armed forces are? So we think there's a couple of really strong characteristics which apply to all armed forces. Specifically, clearly they're very much based on hierarchy, right? You have your generals at the top, you've got your infantry at the bottom, between that you've got various different levels of infantry, then you move into your officers. Specifically, we think there's a big difference in the army between the officers and everyone else. It's very much a class-based system which persists today in terms of the officers are completely distinct from the infantry, creates that divide, which means that often it's very difficult for them to cooperate with one another, particularly for infantry to be heard by the officers. Second characteristic is that we think there's a very strong emphasis on discipline. Obviously, the army is very much based around the idea that soldiers will be able to march 100 miles a day or whatever thing they do. So we think that's a very important thing. Thirdly, clearly armies, for example, have their own legal systems within them. For example, in the UK, you can be taken to military court, same in the USA. So we think that's another unique characteristic. All of these characteristics come together to suggest that soldiers who are in the army aren't like normal workers. They can't speak out in the way that you can in a normal organisation because these concepts of hierarchy and discipline are so much more pervasive in the army because the whole concept of the army is based around that, right? Which means that you can't individually lobby for improvements to your condition because you have these specific conditions attached to your involvement in that organisation, such as the idea of hierarchy, such as the idea of discipline, meaning that normal norms and regulations of being able to speak to your boss and say, you know what, I'm really not not happy about like the level of pay or something. You can't do that because that culture of hierarchy is so drilled into you from the moment that you sign up to the army and go to basic training and go through that whole process, right? So because of that culture, because of the fear that is of reprisal, because of the fact that you're breaking the culture norm, because of the fact that you feel like you're disregarding the idea of hierarchy and discipline, because armies are so bureaucratic in terms of the way they're organized, in terms of losing complaints that come from individuals, we think that armies are actually a very poor means of doing it, as in like representing your labour rights, but also in dealing with complaints specifically. Why specifically do we think that you have to have an external organisation to deal with your complaints rather than just like have the army do it through like internal means, which they have like currently at the moment? We specifically think like if it's through internal things, we think a lot of armies, specifically in like small European nations, are very small and tight knit, right? Like a lot of officers are going to know each other. They're probably going to come from the same select group of private schools and universities, so they're all going to know each other very much. That means that if you're like I don't know, like a private or something at the very bottom of like the food chain of the army, then like literally you're going to be there and you're going to feel, you know what, like my complaint probably isn't going to be taken seriously because everybody knows each other. They're not going to listen to me because of this culture which exists within the army, right? So like we think like literally like the culture means that like everybody will have to feel that the officers are right because you have to abide by hierarchy, meaning it's much less likely you feel like you can use those internal like measures which otherwise exist. So like if you have this external organisation of a trade union which people can join, right, it means that you can actually organise together, you can complain anonymously because you know that that organisation is clearly not associated with the army in its internal ways because it exists separately and it can lobby on your behalf. We think that's an incredibly critical distinction in terms of ensuring that soldiers get the best level of representation they possibly can, in terms of ensuring that they're not subject to abuses of pay, ensuring they're not subject to abuses in terms of like when they're in the field, like officers telling them to do stupid things, because now you actually have this like organisation which you can basically see as neutral in a way that you can never ever see your own internal organisation as being neutral. So what do we think the specific effect of having a trade union is? We think it means that you can delegate complaints to someone else for you, which means that you're much more willing to make those complaints in the first place. Why is that a good thing? Because clearly it means that soldiers get to improve their conditions much more easily. It means they're not vulnerable to labour abuses, or as vulnerable, because they now actually feel like they have means and ways of improving them. In turn, that clearly means that you have soldiers who like literally aren't subject to illegitimate things like sexual abuse, for example, and who actually probably get like a decent level of pay, who can actually lobby for improvements in retirement which otherwise they don't get. All of these incredibly beneficial for quality of life of soldiers, both when they're in the army and when they're out of the army, and critically note, things that we basically treat as norms in any other kind of organisation which exists in the Western world, right? So we think all of that's incredibly important. Second point, moving on, is like specifically we think like the sort of hierarchy of like order within the army is particularly a problem, right? So we think like the attitude of officers is likely to change because of the emergence of trade unions, because we're presuming like generally that like most people who join the trade unions will be like the privates and so on at the bottom of like the army food chain, right? So like we feel like what happens is that once you create this trade union, officers feel like they can get away with far less. Currently, because of that sort of class divide that you have, officers feel like I don't know, like subconsciously that like privates and like people who aren't in the officer corps are sort of like much lower than them. They're sort of not subhuman, but like much lower than them, which means that you get a lot of problems about, for example, officers like committing like acts of sexual abuse on their infantry or whoever they command, or like poor working conditions that they give to them. They feel like they can just get to run the mill. What happens then because of this idea of hierarchy, right? The impact of having a labour union is that you now know that actually your infantry are more likely to be able to come back at you because they now feel like they can complain, and because they have an organisation which can do that, which isn't filled with your chums from the university that you've been to, right? The impact of that means that you're more likely to consider your decisions. It means you're more likely to be considerate of your soldiers. It means you're less likely to get instances of sexual abuse because you know it's more likely to be dealt with because that labour union exists. In turn, that means that soldiers' morale is likely to improve, which means the army is just better functioning as an organisation. Critically note, we care a lot about the quality of life of soldiers because we think they're the same as workers in any other industry. Just because they've chosen to go into the army doesn't mean that they shouldn't be given the same rights and regulations which other people get in society. We think this is critical in terms of ensuring equality, in terms of ensuring that the unique vulnerabilities of the army are dealt with. For all those reasons proposed.
Thank you. Prime Minister, call on the leader of opposition.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about some specific scenarios in which we envision like trade unions being used by the armed forces to improve like their quality of life, and like specifically why trade unions are going to be the only thing that's going to solve those. But also I'm going to talk about like a bit about rebutting what they've said. So right. So firstly, we don't think that we do envision like military versus state happening as well. We think that that's the only way you're going to get things like post-retirement funds like set up in an appropriate way. We kind of touched on it, but we focused on internal things because we think that that's where a lot of the more specific problems to the army exist, because the police totally have the same sort of retirement problems. But I'll get onto that. Okay. Also, like the alternative, so you can do things like only working the required hours, like refusing non-essential tasks. You can do things like going out and protesting and as a union, which is much more effective than anything you could ever do as individuals trying to organize yourselves. You can do you can be your own advocacy group. Like she's like, oh, there's advocacy groups, but well, you can, when you have one that's specifically a trade union, people are more likely to listen to that, and because it has some vague semblance of power, people are more likely to listen to that. On top of that, on the hierarchy forming within a union, like it's totally possible for a union to exist that's like, no thanks, we don't want any officers in this union. This is purely for like infantry level people, and we think that probably most infantry people are going to choose to join that union over a different one that did allow officers, because of the reasons we've outlined. With there being cultural problems between the two groups, they're quite likely to choose one that just represents them. So we don't think that like this is going to happen. We also don't have a problem with like officers having their own union as well. Like that's totally fine, because they have disputes with the government as well. No thank you. Okay, so this idea of like function relying on this hierarchy and how we're going to totally compromise that. Right, firstly, right, the people who join an army, right, are not going to be the type of people who are going to try and sort of have a massive union dispute and go like on as close to strike as they can during a war. Why? No, thank you, sorry. Because they are generally people who are like relatively patriotic, right? Obviously, some people are in it for the money, but most people are in there because they, to some extent, think that they should fight for their country, right? So they're unlikely to do something that is obviously compromising of that any time of war. So we think it's unrealistic to show that the union's ever going to be difficult during a time of war, because they're probably full of people that quite like their country and don't want to compromise that. On top of that, right, like this idea that the army's going to have massive influence over the government. Well, like, currently the army has influence over the government in that they could maybe, overthrow the government in a coup, but they don't, because that's like, because of the cultural attachment to the idea of democracy or whatever government form they have, they give the government that is non-military authority over them, right? So like this idea that they're just suddenly now they've got undemocratic ways to conquer the government instead of like physical ways to do it, means they're suddenly going to use them, is just like not true either. We don't think that they're going to be any more unreasonable than say the police unions are in most countries, than firefighters unions are. We think that's a very unrealistic scenario that they've painted to us. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to talk about sexual abuse, no thank you, and how like within the military, having a separate organisation is the important thing here. So essentially, right, the reason people don't report sexual abuse, and especially within the military, is because they feel like there is a systematic bias against them, right? And it's very difficult to prove and provide proof that it has happened. So in the military, when you report that, right, the person you report it to is an officer, okay? They then take you to a military court full of officers, no thank you. And the likelihood is that, to some extent, the person who has sexually assaulted you is either an officer or is friends with officers, right? Or is like the wife or spouse or something of an officer, right? That is a problem, because at that point the victim goes, well, obviously the entire system is in favour of my attacker, right? It's obvious, they're obviously going to look at that and say, well, there's no reason why I should report that. But whereas when they see that they're going to get specific advocacy, that is an external organisation run for them and by their peers, that is the point at which they're going to go, well, at least now I have some advocacy within the system, some people who fight for me, some people who support me and my cause. So that means they're much more likely to go into these sort of disputes, right, and actually try to fight them. And also, if they can do it anonymously, is much more likely to get some sort of class action lawsuit from a union than you are from like a vague collection of individuals that you can get. Yes.
You can have the exact same benefits you talk about with things like outside watchdogs that are held accountable. What are the unique?
No. Okay, so the reason that's not true is because outside watchdogs aren't going to be made up of the people who are currently in the military, like currently infantry in the military right now, right? Because they are always going to be made up of kind of like retired people from the future, and maybe like the very upper echelons and of the union are. But the point is that a union is something that people emotionally identify with a lot more than an external watchdog that's being set up by some like government official thousands of miles away when they feel that union's been set up by them and their mates, right? Like that's how people feel about unions. Okay, on top of this, post-retirement care. So the example of this is like heavy industry, okay? Heavy industry has pretty good post-retirement care and pretty good like post-horrific injury care because they have strong unions that spent a long time lobbying those companies to make sure that they provided for people who lost arms or legs in like heavy industry accidents, right? Provided for like widows and widowers of people who died in these sort of accidents. This is something that the military doesn't have, and they can't just say, oh, we'll just deal with that, because it's obviously not being dealt with. It's a systematic problem in hundreds of countries across the entire globe, right, where veterans are not provided for, where veterans' mental health is not provided for, where veterans go homeless all the time, right? These are the sort of issues where a union is going to persecute the state and pursue the state as failing their workers, right? Failing people that they ask to die and give up their bodily health for their entire, and mental health for their entire life for their country, not providing for them. We don't actually care if we lose a minor amount of efficiency in the army if those people get that provision, right? Because we think that's really important. We think that's a massive injustice to those people. And why are labour unions going to do that a lot more than any sort of external watchdog? Well, because the people within it are going to be much better able to convince others of their plight, right? Because they actually are part of it. Also, we think that like people are much more likely to stay part of a labour union once they leave the army if they feel because like that labour union is fighting for their retirement rights as well, right? So, whereas an infantry person who leaves the army is probably not going to have much knowledge of some kind of vague lobbying body that works for veterans, but they have never actually been organised with before. Whereas if they've been in the army and been in that union, they're going to stick with it, and they're going to have a more of a force that's going to push for this sort of thing. We also like, and because currently in the current system, the soldiers who are all asking for better post-retirement care, do not have any way to push their power, and however small amount of power we give them, specifically through a labour union, right? Even if they can't strike, which we again like think is a bit unreasonable for them to do that. Like, that's much better than the status quo. You're much more likely to see change than you are on their side of the house, where there aren't any labour unions entirely. Thank you.
What we heard out of opening opposition was that while the goals of getting more PTSD, these goals are very good, the fact that they undermine the effectiveness of the military means that we shouldn't do this do this motion. We think even if it is the case that we only care about military effectiveness, we think this motion improves the effectiveness of the military, means we get more success in interventions, and we think we also get fewer bad wars. First, if you extraneous points of refutation, right? So what exactly can a sort of union that can't strike do, right? We think that firstly it has the important ability to anonymize complaints, right? That is to say that individuals can sort of take a complaint to the union and they don't have to fear individual repercussions, like being disciplined or sort of being fired or something, or other sort of stigma and mistreatment as a result of their complaints. We think this encourages more people to go forward. Secondly, we think we can force them to have we can force the leadership to have meetings with the unions so that the voices are necessarily heard, right? We think it is often the case that people want to reach solutions. There isn't a mechanism for doing so under the status quo. You can't just talk to the general under the status quo. We think we're able to do that. We think that is a good thing. Secondly, on the idea that the complaints you get are majoritarian and aren't sort of the ones that are good, right? We think that PTSD affects most soldiers. We think similarly a culture of sexual assault is very, very harmful to the vast majority of people. We think this is particularly important in the context of when military cuts is sort of a very, very popular way to sort of go about balancing the budget, right? People are always oh, if we don't have money, let's cut spending on the military. We think it is especially important at this time that we have the soldiers who are looking out for their rights and making sure that they have a sort of good standard of payment. Okay, why does this why does better soldier representation in sort of leadership sort of improves the effectiveness of modern military operations? Okay, because note that interventions under nowadays are usually against considerably weaker forces for humanitarian reasons, right? It's not really great powers against great powers anymore, right? The strongest military body by far nowadays, NATO, and they're not in the foreseeable future going to go to war against each other. That means usually in conflicts there is sort of a massive sort of military sort of military strength in balance, that means that the actual effectiveness of the military doesn't like matter that much, right? So we say, for instance, like the initial invasion against Saddam Hussein was like very swift. He was easily overwhelmed by forces, and we think the problem nowadays is like humanitarian intervention. So we think that deals with a lot of their claims about ineffectiveness, because we think fundamentally the military ineffectiveness is not something that is that concerning right now. But we say even if that's true, we just don't think it does, because they've conflated all the different types of obedience, right? We think obedience is important because it means that like there's a wider strategy in the battlefield. That means that if you don't do your role, the whole sort of like operation like comes down. It means you endanger other units, right? We don't think obedience in obedience against sort of like the culture of like covering up sexual assault, or for instance in obedience in terms of like pay or like PTSD undermines the sort of like military operations, right? That we're not letting them to just like do nothing. And we think moreover there's a strong sense of camaraderie, that they want to be out there for their fellow units, and we just don't think the sort of the culture of obedience they talk about, they've conflated this sort of obedience with another type which is kind of like irrelevant in this distinction. So like, okay, given that it is often humanitarian interventions and state building that is the most crucial element of military interventions nowadays, how do we improve this on our side of the house, right? We think that so you need to have a new state after you replace this sort of dictatorial autocrat, and we think what this means is you need a lot of buy-in from the local population, because fundamentally the new institutions you create require legitimacy. Why should soldiers have more say? We think they are the ones who interact with the local population on the ground and are sort of like there in the country, who have like the most awareness of what's happening, right? We think they have the most knowledge of how people actually feel. This is something it's very difficult for a general to find out, like how much do they trust these new institutions, right, when they're sort of like in their military base, like in the Pentagon, for instance. We think also, moreover, they have the most human contact, so they have more empathy, right? We think they actually see the suffering that might be caused by like the conflict, and we think they actually see the results of like military policy, right? We think the problem under the status quo is that military policy is decided by people who are very, very far away. So we think in Iraq, for instance, there's a mistake of using sort of like brutal tactics because of the misidentified problem that like we just needed to kill all the insurgents and that's fine, not realizing that this was exacerbating the very problem that was undermining their success in the first place. But I'll take you.
Your entire rebuttal of effectiveness isn't important. It's very, like, America-centric. There are different states that go against each other in small-scale conflicts for which the perception of security and the perception of vulnerability is very important.
Okay, like, you just, like, ignored my section on, like, how the obedience is actually important. It's different to the disobedience that would occur under, like, our side, right? We don't think they're just going to sort of, like, ditch their units. We think it's, like, disagreeing over pay is something that's very valid and doesn't undermine military effectiveness, and more on effectiveness data, right? So we think like enhanced interrogation, those ideas were very much ordered from the top. Like Bush created a sort of like a legal loophole for this to happen, and this was like ordered to happen. We think in our world, when you have those forced meetings, the soldiers can have a greater say and voice the ineffectiveness of these sorts of policies and actually provide like proper updates on what's going on and what needs to be done. Secondly, we think this is something that soldiers want, right? Because notice that the unhappiness they have with the culture they have is going to exist under both sides of the house. What does this mean? We think when they have no channel for resolution, you get two effects. Firstly, desertion, which we think greatly undermines your effectiveness, because it means like you're not there when other units are like depending on you, but moreover you need to sort of like look for those people, like recover them as well, which is obviously very costly. And secondly, we think people don't want to join in the first place when they hear that the army is like sort of like not a good place to work and that your complaints aren't really listened to. We think that also undermines its effectiveness at the point where you have a considerably smaller size. Now, secondly, why do we have fewer bad wars? We think the interests of the soldiers generally align with the interests of the public and what comes into a good war, right? So we think they care about their safety, and we think they fundamentally risk their lives for this idea of improving the world and saving lives. We think they are unlikely to have some sort of like political motivation, for instance, influenced by the oil lobby, like the people at the top, right? So we think the ones which are like the most harmful, like the ones which are resource motivated, or the ones which are sort of very dangerous and they're unlikely to succeed and it's just going to be a fruitless waste of life, we think those are the types of wars that they are going to oppose. And we think under the status quo you don't get the accountability, because war usually isn't an election issue, right? It happens when a threat emerges. And we say at the point at which you have no accountability on governments who decide to go to war because of whatever political agenda they have, we think soldiers and their good interests provide a crucial check on sort of like needless like bad wars that the government may choose to do without a democratic mandate. For those reasons, so proud to stand in proposition.
government and call them numbered officers. They're here.
Ready? What all teams have missed thus far is the long term. What incentives do we give to soldiers when we tell them that they don't have to absolutely obey? What does this mean for a culture of civilian democracy that depends on soldiers not as individuals, but as a collective to be sacrificed for the good of the nation? I'm going to tell you why this notion uniquely harms the culture of democracy that is incredibly important, especially in states that have emerged recently from civil wars like Myanmar. First, some extraneous refutation. The point that opening government brings up about hierarchy and class-based systems, I have three responses to. Firstly, it's not necessarily a really important problem because in places like the United States, there's often a lot of prestige and respect associated with the military. That's why, for instance, you get veterans who can advocate for themselves to have better health care, for instance. Secondly, all the benefits they bring up are not unique. We can have all the benefits they talk about by setting up outside agencies that people in the military can then advocate to. Indeed, often these outside agencies are better because they appear to be more objective, so that they have more credibility in the public eye. They haven't really told us why labor unions uniquely give us that benefit. No, thank you. The last thing we would say is, even if we buy all their analysis about the benefits this gives to soldiers, on the comparative, it doesn't really matter, because as open opposition tells you about national security, and as we're going to tell you about democracy, it's worth giving up all of that for the benefit of the collective. Next thing that closing government tells you is about interventions against smaller parties, how essentially military effectiveness isn't very important in the status quo. Two responses. First, this is blatantly false. I would tell you to tell what you just said to Eastern European states who have Russia on the border. We say that military effectiveness is especially important, is still important in deterring invaders from coming across your border and fighting people. So this disincentive force is very important. The last thing they talked about was how soldiers in principle should have a say because they have the most knowledge about things happening on the ground. Two responses. The first is that they didn't give a mechanism for why labor unions uniquely provide this benefit. But the second and more important response is that all of that is just an argument for getting generals to know more about the countries they're actually invading. We don't understand why actually labor unions provide this benefit uniquely. Extension on why we harm the culture of civilian democracy and how we increase the risk of coups on their side of the house. Firstly, what is the status quo? Actually, what is the preferable status quo? And this is the status quo in most Western liberal democracies. The preferable status quo is a culture where the military absolutely obeys a civilian government. Indeed, in the United States, for instance, the head of the military is a civilian. It's a society where the military follows all the commands of democracy. Why is this important? It's important, firstly, because it ensures the military does not direct government contrary to the wishes of the people. And this is especially important because the military is the body that has the most coercive power in the state. They have the guns, they can get people, no thank you, to do whatever they want. So it's important to have this culture of obedience to make sure the military doesn't go and do random coups. How is this culture maintained usually in the status quo? It's maintained by having soldiers obey everything that we tell them to do. Indeed, all military leaders do, 1 second please, is follow general directives. They don't go out and make their own policy and have their own demands. They do whatever the president or the head of the civilian military tells them to do. It's a culture where military leaders and soldiers in general essentially have no say. Essentially what they are individual soldiers matter less on the comparative than the collective they're defending. Sure.
Okay, how is there a culture of obedience when the people who actually decide what the military does, i.e. the generals, have all the power and they have basically the entire will of the soldiers to do whatever?
The important thing is, so two responses. Firstly, obedience is important because soldiers need to obey what generals tell them to do. As I'm going to talk about later, when you tell soldiers that their demands matter too, and you give them the power to disobey, you break that culture. Okay, so what is the impact of this culture, essentially? And why is this dominance justified, especially in taking away the individual rights of soldiers? It's firstly justified because soldiers consent to joining the army. That is to say, they make informed decisions. But secondly, and more importantly, this dominance is justified for greater security of the nation. That is to say, ensuring that everybody follows orders, especially in life and death situations, often contributes to effectiveness of military situations. And this culture is especially important in areas with military instability, areas that are emerging from civil war and need to create this culture of obedience so that the military doesn't have another coup d'etat against the government as we've seen in Myanmar. So, how does this motion specifically harm civilian democracy? No, thank you. It does so by giving soldiers power. It is the symbolism of giving them power and giving them the way to accede to their demands. It gives soldiers a sense of their own individuality that is mediated through the military. So essentially what happens is that soldiers can demand from the organization and the civilian head whatever they want, and they get what they want. Indeed, this is dangerous because we consent to it. So what are the impacts of this specifically? 2 impacts, no thank you. The first is that soldiers get used now to asking for things and getting them. That means they don't always have to obey orders getting to them. They don't always have to obey the conditions given to them. Open government told you, it basically said that soldiers can't strike under this model, but even if they can't strike legally, it's unclear how this is going to be enforced. Indeed, the military often is usually called in to stop strikes. It's unclear why military is going to follow this order, especially when now they have the motivation to strike because they have the desire to go against the demands of the civilian military. The second impact of this is that the military is more likely now to want to assert themselves in other areas, because you create a culture where the military is just another area where you can pursue your self-interest. You erase the culture of sacrifice that's been really important in building the stability in civilian states. So for example, the military is going to be more likely, under their world, to want to influence the government, to want to change the government it doesn't like. They mostly talked about Western liberal democracies, but this motion is especially important in a global context. Imagine this happening in Myanmar, well, if we gave soldiers labor unions. Imagine the instability caused when we tell them they can demand whatever they want. What is the comparative in this debate? To an extent, state policy must be utilitarian. This means that we should care about the harms to the most number of people. If we have to make individuals in the military subservient to the demands of the collective, even if we buy all their analysis of the benefits of the collective, we are fine with that, because the most important thing in this debate is caring about the long term, maintaining the supremacy of civilian government against the demands of individual soldiers, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, member of opposition, and call upon the government secretary.
All right, is everyone ready? The characterization that we get from side opposition about how soldiers will somehow behave once they realize that they have any degree of bargaining power is frankly ridiculous. This idea that when you recognize that you can advocate for your basic humanity, for basic pay, for basic services, that you will somehow run away from missions, that you will disobey all orders you ever receive, that you will put your country's safety at risk is frankly ridiculous. What we think is much more reasonable and much more likely is that soldiers, like any members of any other labor union you see all around the world in any other industries, will advocate for basic rights, will advocate for their basic humanities, and argue to be respected as any other human being would. We don't believe that they're going to try to just simply compromise missions. We actually believe, as my partner has stated very succinctly, that this will actually make modern militaries more effective, because a lot of the reasons we're seeing modern militaries fail is precisely because of these hierarchies that no longer apply to modern conflicts. We're extremely proud to propose. So 2 questions in adjudicating this debate. Firstly, who actually has a more effective military that actually gets things done? Because we can see that the military is different from a lot of different industries in terms of like defending national safety. And secondly, who gets better outcomes for soldiers? So let's talk about this more effective military point, because they seem to conflate all types of obedience as the same kind of obedience. I don't think
that's true, right? I think that there are lots of different ways that you can be obedient and lots of different ways that you cannot be obedient. It's not simply that once I realized that I had some sort of power over my parents and then I was an autonomous human being, that I suddenly didn't listen to anything they ever said and made horrible, rash decisions that put my own self-interest at risk. I think it is much more likely that you start to argue for things that give you better outcomes, but also recognize that there are certain things that people in positions of authority do to keep you safe. I find it very unlikely that when you go on a very risky mission that you're somehow going to run away and desert your commander simply because he is putting you in a dangerous situation. I think you recognize, and reasonable human beings can tell the difference between a mission where they need to listen to people to keep themselves safe in the moment and, I don't know, advocating for like better tribunals to deal with sexual assault. We think that reasonable human beings can tell the difference. They haven't told us why all types of obedience are always the same in all circumstances. We think it is much more likely that reasonable human beings are going to advocate for much more reasonable things, like we see people in labor unions do all the time, see the police, also an extremely important arm of the state. We don't see police officers running around asking for ridiculous things like having the state throw birthday parties for them. We think that they're probably much more likely to ask for things like equal pay, like reasonable working hours. We just don't see how these things are the same thing. Sure, but you disagree.
What a straw man, ma'am. We're not saying people are going to run away from their missions, right? At the end of the day, in order for the state to listen to you, you have to do something that makes it difficult.
They haven't been able to give us a single example of what these frivolous claims would be that would actually undermine the effectiveness of missions. We have told you that we think it is much more reasonable that they're going to advocate for things like equal pay, like PTSD treatment, like sexual assault recognition. We think that these are the things that are most likely to argue for, that are the least likely to actually undermine mission effectiveness, that are the least likely to undermine national security. These kinds of things that they're likely to argue for are the furthest things away from the things that are actually going to compromise national security. We just don't think that this makes any sense. But let's talk about modern warfare and how we actually are more likely to get more effective militaries when you have people listening to people a bit more at the bottom. If we look at military operations like the Iraq War, where you send individuals in to do things like nation building, like you see members of NATO doing, like you see members of UN security peacekeeping forces doing, the things that actually make them effective is when they listen to the people at the bottom who tell them these people are terrified of us. And these missions that we are trying to do are actually really, really ineffective because we are not learning how to communicate with people on the bottom. We think that when you actually disrupt this hierarchy and listen to people who have very, very valuable feedback about what is working and what is not working, rather than taking orders from someone sitting in the White House or at the seat of the UN or wherever these commands are coming from, this is actually when you get better militaries that better interact with people. Gone are the days of tank invasions or people coming by boat to overtake territories. That's not the kind of warfare we see. We see things like cyber warfare, where it's very important to understand how individuals interact on a local level. We see the types of things like nation building, where it's very important to understand how people at the bottom interact with other soldiers and infantrymen. We think it's actually quite a good thing to disrupt the hierarchy in certain ways. We're perfectly fine to take this because we just don't see the kinds of commanders sending big troops out to go storm a beach. That's not what modern warfare looks like. We're perfectly fine to disrupt the hierarchy in that sense. Okay, but they've tried to tell us that this doesn't make sense in a lot of other situations where you have, non-Western countries, smaller civil wars, those kinds of things. But what we would argue is that, when you are more accountable to the people actually fighting the war, the ones that are more likely to put their lives on the line, when you listen to whether or not they maybe want to be involved or whether or not they're getting good protections, when you are emerging from a civil war in a period of extreme instability and likely to get into smaller sectarian conflicts and border skirmishes, it is far more likely that you're going to get better outcomes when you listen to the people who don't want their lives to be endangered, and you're much more likely to be risk averse rather than have hot-headed and hawkish generals be able to take control of the military because somehow everyone just has to listen to them and that's a thing that makes sense. We think that you're much more likely to avoid conflict when you have situations where there is a norm of listening to people at the bottom and avoiding the kinds of conflicts. We think this makes sense on smaller local levels, but we also think that this makes sense on larger national levels. So this leads into the second question: who gets better outcomes for soldiers? And we've talked to you a lot about how this actually is more likely to make nations risk averse. They enshrine the ideals of democracy and not wanting soldiers to overrun the democratic process, but let's remember that the process of going to war is actually extremely undemocratic in the status quo. It's very rarely a voting issue for citizens. It's very rarely something that people collectively get to decide to do together, precisely because the military is disconnected from the democratic process in a lot of ways. So what you're likely to see is when you have more accountability to the actual people on the ground that have families at home, the actual people on the ground ground who really have things at stake. You're more likely to go to wars that more people are committed to, which are more likely to be legitimate wars because they're more aligned with the interests of the country. You're less likely to get the kinds of wars that you go into when you have people at the top simply making decisions, because there are very few ways that the military is accountable to the public in the status quo. We think that makes that better. So they've tried to tell us that for advocacy, in terms of getting better outcomes for individual soldiers, they are able to get that with, like, independent organizations. What we've told you up and down the bench is that this happens in the status quo, and it's ineffective precisely because you have other lobbies that are more powerful. When you have oil lobbies fighting across borders for, like, getting control of natural resources, those are the ones that can actually put people in positions of power, governmental officials that can actually bribe them and lobby against them and have real teeth. These organizations that support people, like, getting treatment for things like PTSD, are the last organizations that actually have teeth to truly convince governmental officials to do these things in their best interest. We think that when you have unions, you get the unique benefits of aggregating and measuring claims accurately rather than having them report internally. You get the unique benefits of being the only organization with teeth, the only one that can ever threaten anything to get these basic human dignities represented. Because we think we have a more effective modern military, we get better outcomes for soldiers, and we ultimately participate in a society that is more risk averse as it tries to participate in more just wars overall. We are extremely proud to propose.
Call upon the opposition. We're here.
All right, so I think we could effectively say this debate comes down to an interesting conversation between, like, how do we best support the military and how do we actually deal with, like, the hierarchy structures required to have an effective military in combat situations, right? Like, what we get coming out of closing government is much along the lines of, we're going to have these labor unions that are, like, magically more effective than outside advocacy groups, but that are somehow not actually using any of the functions that labor unions do, right? Like, keep in mind that labor unions are only effective because they're able to control labor, right? Like, even if you're not striking, the whole idea of, oh, we'll just not do non-essential tasks, or we're just not going to do some of the things that we generally don't like to do, or we'll work slower, or we'll just be awake for less hours, all critically affect smaller militaries. But even if you're dealing with larger militaries like Canada, Britain, the United States, Russia, and China, like, you're actually fundamentally putting other people at risk, right? Like, if I'm in any type of combat zone, which is generally where you're putting any type of military, if I am not doing my job to the full extent that someone up top is expecting me, then some task somewhere is not getting done. And if this task is expected to get done, it's probably because it needs to be done so that other people can be freaking secure, right? Like, let's be honest. If the person sweeping the roads for mines is like, I'm just going to sweep for 7 hours rather than 10 hours, I am missing 3 hours worth of mines, and the car is going to drive over and more likely to explode. I don't really care if you want to personally believe that, like, oh, mine people aren't going to be stupid, but it's the same type of concept. The only reason that a labor union is listened to by the people higher above is because they control labor. Other than that, they're essentially not much different than smaller lobbying groups. No, thank you. So, why can we establish then, coming out of that we have essential harms? What we're talking about then is now a direct comparison between the safety of the military at large, the effectiveness of the military at large, the ability for the military to protect its government, and the ability for the military to, get general better pay, right? Like, we can agree on side opposition that we want the military to be better off, but at the same time, we don't want to put the government at risk. We don't think that's an insane thing. Like, when my partner points out that it's generally not okay and principally not okay to put your government at risk for the fact that you want to get paid $2 extra an hour, is not something that I need to actually worry about being principally wrong. Because, yes, we want to support our military, but it's not going to help the military if the government that they're trying to support collapses into freaking anarchy because a foreign country that's generally not liked them for a long time realizes that they're having discourse and issues internally with their military strikes within this short time, right? Because even when we're talking about smaller discontent among the military, any type of efficiency issues when we're comparing relatively similar militaries puts you at a disadvantage. We generally don't want to get invaded by other people. So, what main questions do we think this round comes down to? First of all, how do labor unions actually function? I've already started a little bit into this. 2, what are some long-term effects from labor unions? Why do we think the analysis from my partner is actually the most important in this round? And generally, why do we think government side, especially closing government side, is giving you a lot of things that just A, aren't going to happen, but even if they did happen, are actually naturally detrimental to the military at large? Cheryl, take front half.
In OG, we show you 2 things. Firstly, we show you that soldiers are always going to have their interests aligned with the state, which means they're not going to go to war and just decide not to clear mines because they're not getting paid. Secondly, we also show you that labour unions aren't just about collective bargaining, they're also about giving access to services and individual rights, which we think this is a gross simplification.
Like, labour unions are required the ability to control labour. You are no more than a group of people who want to say words on some type of military forum unless you have control of some type of resource. If you mean nothing, the military command that you're requesting something from is not going to do anything for you if they've already been ignoring all of your requests to begin with, right? Like, I don't think it's all that unreasonable to point out that we already have issues internally in the military. People already make requests. If we don't control labor, if we don't have some type of bargaining chip, when we make requests as a group in the future, it doesn't actually change anything if the hierarchy at large can go like, oh, if we don't do this, they'll still be good patriots. But if they're not going to be good patriots, we fall into the issues that our front half of my partner has already talked about, where you're screwing over the military at large, either in small ways or in large ways, and if it's in small ways, it still adds up because you're talking about massively large unions, apparently of all the privates, or even just a significant majority of the privates who are deciding to be slightly less effective. 1% times 50 different people is a 50% problem. I think we can all agree on that. So, why do we think, more importantly, that we understand the long-term effects of labor unions? The essential idea of a labor union is that I'm telling these soldiers, I'm telling them that we think that you should have the ability to disrupt the hierarchy and chain of command because you want to ask and request things. Like, we've already gotten some of the analysis from this, where the hierarchy depends on this top-down analysis. It depends on the ability that for officers to determine that if I make a request, the request will get done. The officer should not need to sit there and go, ooh, I hope that this soldier doesn't decide that this is the day he's going to take an hour off, right? We don't think it's reasonable then to be in any type of scenario where your military is playing like a guessing game with who they're going to assign tasks to. Right? We generally think that in the long term what this does is it's going to actually have military soldiers who think that in a lot of scenarios they have a bigger say than they should, and you're going to put military operations and policies into question where you have people who are going, I don't know if we can actually do this, even though we require it for the safety and security of the state at large, and you're now gambling with how your government's going to function back after.
To what extent do soldiers' rights even exist? Like, do you support conscription if all you care about is sort of this so-called effectiveness?
So keep in mind that, like, a lot of these soldiers that we're talking about are already people who have opted into this scenario. Like, a lot of these soldiers we're talking about generally are not actually conscripted, but are people who are volunteered for these tasks, right? We're talking about scenarios where these soldiers have decided that I know that I see that the military already purports itself as a very regimented and controlled operation, an operation that generally doesn't listen to people lower down the chain, and I want to join into this, right? My partner talked about this when he was talking about most people join it for the prestige, or most people join it because they're patriots and they want to fight for their country, right? They're generally not people who are joining it thinking that the military is this great place that gives them all of these beautiful and amazing benefits, but they're joining it because they believe this is something essential to do with their lives to protect their country. When we're talking about people who are willing to buy into a system to protect their country, we think that that's fundamentally them agreeing that they're willing to give away some of their rights for the protection of society at large. They're agreeing that they think that some of their rights necessarily need to be ignored so that everyone else's rights can be kept sacred, that everyone else's rights can be looked after, right? Like, we can't actually ensure that society can look after the rights of the people when we can't ensure the security of that society, right? We think that's generally problematic. We actually think we still get a better world when we're not doing these labor unions. But more importantly, finally, when we have these labor unions and we're telling them that these top-down approaches aren't going to exist, we get this whole idea out of back half that's saying, oh, these labor unions aren't really going to affect military policy, but we're going to talk to the labor unions to get better military policy. We think this is an interesting, weird dichotomy they're trying to buy into. They tell us we're not going to get any actual issues, but we're going to go to these labor unions and magically get a better world. We think that if the hierarchy already isn't listening to these privates, when the privates are saying it would be better if we do it this way, or if they're telling their lieutenant commander that we think we're going to have a better world or a better operation if we do things this way, and they're not listening, unless this labor union is going to take some type of dramatic action, they're not going to listen into the future, mainly because they don't have the resources, time, or concern to do so. This is why, as an opposition, we think that generally this is gradually insane, why we're glad to oppose.
I thank the op whip and indeed everyone in the round. If you